You're listening to Bona Fide Needs, Season 3, Episode 3. Hi, and welcome back to Bona Fide Needs. I'm Bill Olver, Managing Editor of the PubK Group. The Department of Justice has released its False Claims Act statistics for fiscal year 2023, including the total amount of financial recoveries and where those dollars came from. Joining me today to discuss the stats and to break down the story behind the numbers are Arnold and Porter partners Tirzah Lollar and Sheehan. We'll also check in on developments involving the Supreme Court's decision in Polansky, which raised questions about the constitutionality of the FCA's key TAM provisions and how the Department of Justice is using its SCOTUS-confirmed dismissal authority over whistleblower cases. Tirzah and Christian, welcome back to the podcast again. Glad to have you here. Let's take a minute again to refresh our audience's memories and introduce you. Tirzah, let's start with you.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having us back. Really glad to be here talking all things False Claims Act yet again. So I'm a partner here in the white collar practice at Arnold and Porter, where a significant portion of my practice is defending companies in government investigations and litigation involving the False Claims Act. And I do primarily most of my work for government contractors.
And thanks, Bill. It's great to be back with you. I'm Christian Sheehan, and like Tirzah, I'm a partner in the DC office of Arnold and Porter, a white collar partner, and I also focus primarily on False Claims Act defense, in particular on the procurement side. So looking forward to talking to you today.
Well, welcome back. It's always a pleasure. So let's start with some interesting recent developments. The Department of Justice, as it does every year, has released its analysis of the last year's False Claims Act recoveries. What did we see in those? What were the takeaways? Do we see some big dollars this year, some good cases?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. First of all, I'll say that DOJ used to release their stats a lot earlier, like a couple months after the fiscal year ended, and that just keeps getting longer and longer. So I don't know if they're trying to massage the numbers or what it is, but so last year they brought in almost $2.7 billion into the False Claims Act, which sounds like an awful lot of money, and it is a significant jump from last year. But it's still one of the lower years over the course of the last 15 or so, which is sort of when we've been tracking it. There are always some peaks and valleys if you're looking at, sort of a graph year by year. And the peaks are driven by what we call, quote unquote, blockbuster settlements. And those are things in the past that have been related to the financial crisis, settlements with opioid manufacturers. But so taking into account those peaks and valleys, the average recovery is about $3.5 billion a year. And so DOJ is well below that. DOJ did tout that last year was a record in one respect, which was that there were more recoveries in terms of the number of individual recoveries than ever before. That was driven largely by pandemic-related matters. So you see in the statistics, there's almost half of the settlements were low dollar value matters related to the pandemic. The average recovery was only like $180,000 compared to the rest, where the average was almost 10 million.
And Christian, these are often or mostly Paycheck Protection Program cases,
That's right?
Where the allegations are that a borrower falsely certified their eligibility to receive funds under the Paycheck Protection Program or their eligibility to have the loans forgiven. And so these are those cases.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we have seen not much enforcement yet against lenders in the PPP space, but we have, I believe there's at least one resolution. And in recent public statements, DOJ has talked about sort of turning its focus on pandemic fraud to lenders. So it'll be interesting to see whether we start to see more resolutions with lenders. So in terms of where the dollars were coming from last year, the overwhelming majority was still from the healthcare industry, more than 2/3. That's a drop, though. Historically, it's north of 80%. there were a few really pretty significant recoveries in the defense space last year, which is driving that number. Aside from the raw numbers in terms of dollars, what I think is the most interesting trend last year is dramatic increase in matters initiated directly by DOJ. So historically, I mean, Bill, the 1986 amendments to the False Claims Act sort of reinvigorated the qui tam provisions. And ever since then, we've seen a big spike in qui tam cases, while the number of cases initiated by DOJ has declined until recent years when we started to see a bump. And last year was sort of off the charts. 500 cases initiated by DOJ, which is a record by almost, I think, more than 150 matters. Again, in public statements, DOJ has attributed this to their increased use of data analytics, particularly in the healthcare space, to identify outlier healthcare providers. It's unclear how DOJ could use sort of this capability in the procurement space, but they're clearly looking for opportunities to do that if they're out there. And another indicator that DOJ is still really active is DOJ issued the most CIDs ever last year, more than 1,500 CIDs. I mean, that's only a portion of FCA investigations, right? The FCA investigations there could be IG subpoenas. So when you add those on, we're probably talking about, somewhere close to 2,000 formal requests for information related to False Claims Act investigations. So we'll see what next year holds. I mean, by our count here, and these are not DOJ official stats, disclaimer, these are our tracking, which is based on publicly released information. So far in 2024, DOJ sitting at about $1.4 billion. And that number took a pretty big spike recently with a significant settlement involving an opioid manufacturer.
So Christian, I've heard you say a cynical person would see some correlation between this spike in DOJ initiated cases and something that we've talked on the podcast about before.
Yeah, so right in the summer in the Supreme Court's decision in Polansky, Justice Thomas expressed concern that the qui tam provisions of the False Claims Act are unconstitutional. Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett agreed that that's an issue the Supreme Court should look at. Bill, I know that I think we spoke with you about that a couple months ago. So I would like to think that DOJ shares our view that there's a risk that the qui tam provisions will be found unconstitutional. So they're practicing. For when they don't have any more relators. Maybe that's not the case, but that's what I like to think.
So on that line of conversation, yes, that was the last time that we had you on, was to talk about the Supreme Court's decision in Polansky, which raised a pretty shocking comment from Justice Clarence Thomas about the constitutionality of the qui tam provisions. So is there any update on that? Any movement? I know there have been a couple of cases filed at lower court levels challenging the constitutionality. They saw that door open and went right through it. So where do we stand on that?
Yeah, that's right. So full disclosure, 2 of those cases are ours. But by our count, there are 5 right now. There are 2 that have been resolved, one publicly, one not. The only public decision that's been issued is in the Wallace case in Alabama, where the court rejected the challenge. And then, interestingly, there was that the defendant then sought to certify it for interlocutory appeal. One of the requirements is that reasonable jurists could disagree. And the district court said the reasonable jurist could not disagree, despite the fact that 3 Supreme Court justices seem to disagree. So we'll see. We have one that's pending in South Carolina that has been fully briefed, no hearing set yet. There is a hearing set in a case that's pending in the Middle District of Florida, set for April 22nd. So that may be the next one where we get a decision. I mean, I think the fact that the court set the hearing